Do you know, I was just in the airport here in California going through security, and the gentleman by my side just asked me about my PIN, and we started a conversation. In no time, I could pull out of my wallet a picture of I have a little mini version of the shroud always on me. And he followed me to my gate, and he had a later flight. We talked 45 minutes probably about Jesus and the shroud. He had never heard about it. He's a new Christian. He was a Muslim.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes. I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of that shroud over the last 2 millennium. Today, I'm talking with Father Andrew Dalton, and he is one of the top speakers and promoters and evangelizers and everything good related to the shroud. But before we get going, let me tell you a little bit about him. Father Andrew Dalton is a Legionary of Christ priest, and he's a theology professor in Rome, and he specializes in the Gospels, Biblical Hebrew, and of course the Shroud of Turin. And he is the author of the book The Fulfilled Israel, and that came out in 2024. And more importantly, and we can see behind him an image of Athonia. So he is a board member of the Athonia group. And so, Father Dalton, it's so great to have you.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Guy. What an honor and privilege.
Oh, absolutely. The honor and privilege is all mine. So, well, before we get started, so what is your backstory on the Shroud of Turin? How did you get involved in this thing?
Yeah, it seemed like an accident. Now I see it as very providential and kind of a vocation within a vocation. I was in Rome studying philosophy and theology, and in preparation for the priesthood. I had no intention to specialize in the shroud. But they handed me the keys to this exhibit in the downstairs of our university where these two priests back in 2006 had created the first Othonia museums. It's called Who is the Man of the Shroud? And of course, we're a very international community. They said, "Oh, Brother Andrew, you speak English? Here, learn this. Learn how to present this to pilgrims." I didn't know anything about it. But one day, Father Pasquale, he said, "Listen, today is going to come a shroud expert. You need to sit in and learn from Emanuela Marinelli." And that's when I first heard an expert speak about the shroud, and I was fascinated. I couldn't believe I was 10 years a seminarian, and I had not heard any of this. I lost sleep that very day and said, "This is an amazing opportunity for evangelization." And so they say that the best way to learn is to teach. And so there I was teaching, week after week, just guiding pilgrims through our exhibit. But I started to learn first from Emanuela Marinelli, and then the next week it was a physicist by the name of Paolo Di Lazzaro. I'm sure you know, and you and your
Hmm.
audience would know him and his great work. And then a week later, it was Barry Schwartz, the late, great Barry Schwartz, the Jewish gentleman who was technical photographer at the Shroud of Turin Research Project. He stayed for an intensive course of 2 weeks. And I picked up Barry from the airport and went out with pizza and hung out with him on his cigarette breaks. And I was just happy to absorb all things Shroud. It was so fascinating that we have this most studied archaeological object in the history of the world, and it's compatible, perfectly compatible, and I would say even illuminating of the scriptures, the story that we've always heard in our churches and we celebrate throughout the year. Well, now we have a cold hard fact, an artifact that speaks to the historical event of Jesus' passion, his death, his burial, and I believe even his resurrection. And so I went on to specialize in biblical theology. I just got my doctorate about 5 years ago now, and I teach the biblical theology of the Passion in light of the Shroud of Turin for our postgraduate certificate in Shroud Studies at APRA. And so Othonia is simply the tool that allows us to share about Jesus and the Shroud so that people might know and love him throughout the world. That is our goal. And to that end, we have museums, we have teaching material, and we have these great events, international symposia on shroud studies. That was something that happened in Rome a few years ago. That came to the States, as you know, last summer through the Great Sikh SEEC conference in St. Louis. And so the circle just keeps growing. The enthusiasm for the shroud is a global phenomenon. I've spoken all over the world. Last summer, I think I was in 16 cities or something like that, starting in London and then moving down to Sydney and Auckland. I was in Singapore and Hong Kong, here in the United States in several different states and cities. But the everywhere the interest is the same. And you don't have to be Catholic, you don't have to be Christian to be fascinated by the shroud. Many of the venues in which I speak are purely secular, and they're just as interested there. And I think there's a real mission. So thank you for channels like yours that educate and get good information and accessible to just people with interest, because that was hard to come by. When I was a seminarian, it was not easy to know. And I think nowadays it's so much more readily at hand. The For those who want to find the information, they can. There's still plenty of bad information out there, but there's also many, many good voices, thanks be to God, that are treating the shroud responsibly, and I think it bodes well for the future.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think certainly with the internet and just over the last couple of years, I don't know what it is, but it just seems like the knowledge and the publications, the internet and everything, the YouTubes and the TikToks and the Instagrams, there's exploding
It is.
concerning the shroud, and which is a good thing because one of the things that we as Christians are supposed to do is go out and evangelize, and
Right.
the shroud is such an easy. It is such an easy way to evangelize to anyone, and it's so good to see you out there, as well promoting and bringing the message of the Bible and Jesus and using the shroud as one of the methods to do that.
Right. Do you know, I was just in the airport here in California going through security, and the gentleman by my side just asked me about my PIN, and we started a conversation. In no time, I could pull out of my wallet a picture of I have a little mini version of the shroud always on me. And he followed me to my gate, and he had a later flight. We talked 45 minutes probably about Jesus and the shroud. He had never heard about it. He's a new Christian. He was a Muslim who just converted to Christianity, and yet this was still brand new to him. So you never know what you're able to do. In short, what I love about it is it gets you directly, not just to the Bible generally, but to the heart of the story, right? To Jesus, and not just Jesus generally, but in his passion, death, and resurrection. And that is the core of our Christian faith, and it always will be. And so I look in my priesthood of 13 years, I've never seen anything as fruitful as the shroud as a means to bring people to Christ. I look, if there's other things out there, let me know, because I'm always going to be interested. I'm just saying, in my experience, the shroud is an amazing tool. I love my biblical studies, but to be honest, people don't often ask me about Matthew's fulfillment paradigm in the airport, much less. But on the shroud, yes, they often do.
Yeah, you're so right. It's funny. I said in one of these YouTubes, I said, well, the shroud is the singular piece of evidence, an artifact, a relic of the resurrection that is the most important thing for Christians. And I was
Mm,
reprimanded because it's
mm,
not just for Christians, it's for all
mm.
of mankind. And
Good call.
when you're talking about the recent conversion of a Muslim, absolutely the shroud and the resurrection is the singular thing for all
Yeah,
mankind.
right. Paul is a striking statement what he says there. If Jesus isn't risen from the dead, my preaching is in vain. Oh, and your faith is in vain. It's useless. It's futile. It's going nowhere if Jesus isn't risen from the dead. Of course, he knows that Jesus is, and that the foundation for the whole of Christianity is that ground of the truth of an historical event. But do we know that that event took place? How do we know? That's a legitimate question. And I'm just so, I find it so fascinating that the first belief, the first distinctively Christian belief is found in connection with the discovery of the tomb. The tomb, more specifically, with the linen cloths. I'm thinking, of course, of John 20, verses 5 through 8, especially. But here we are, Easter Sunday, the first um, instance in which we see someone say, he saw and believed. And what did he see so that he believed? Well, just read the previous verses. What are they talking about? And who of us would have imagined that the story would play out in this way? They're going to see the linen cloths, and that will be the silent witness that paves the way towards this climactic endpoint. He saw and believed. Oh, we could go on and on about this passage, but what is impossible to miss is that there's a connection between the shroud that wrapped his dead body and the belief of Christian that grounds all of Christianity. Because look, if Jesus is risen from the dead, well, then his word is true, and he's worthy. He's credible, and so much follows after, right? But that is the foundation stone on which is scaffolded everything else. And so I think you're right to say that that is the best place to go to then talk to anyone, any outsider, about what Christianity is. But it'll never be divorced from the person of Jesus risen from the dead.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny, because I use that verse, and from you, I've heard you speak a handful of times, and the way you tell that story of Peter running up to the tomb and John running
Mhm.
up to the tomb, and then him doing the "I saw and believed." I hate to say it, I probably would have been one of the other 11. And as even Jesus is right in front of me, he'd be performing
Right.
miracles and he'd be preaching, and I'd be shaking my head saying, "Yes, absolutely, absolutely." But I would probably have been one of the other 11,
Mm,
where John finally says, "I saw and believed," based on the cloth. And it probably would have been, maybe I would have been the doubting Thomas,
the
says,
doubting
"Until I
Thomas.
put my fingers in his wounds, will I, finally believe." And so, but that is such a powerful verse and a powerful statement that John does, and
Right.
it really
Well,
just strikes me right in my heart about my faith.
me too. And between the beloved disciple who saw and believed, and then Thomas, and we can imagine a whole spectrum. But what is true in each case is evidence that neither just chooses to believe despite countervailing evidence. No, no, they believe in light of what they see. Both John, when he sees the testimony of the shroud, and of course, even more powerfully, Thomas, as he's invited to press and probe into the wounds of Jesus. But in neither case do we have a case of fideism. It's not that they're going to say blindly, I say amen when it makes no sense. Isn't it true that a lot of people have this notion of faith? What is faith? Um, Believing when there's no reason to. No, that is not Jesus's perspective. He says, believe me, or else believe because of the works that I do. He does works, he does signs. And what's his principal sign? Well, the sign of Jonah, in his own words, right? Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, well, so too the Son of Man, 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Of course, Jesus references his descent into death and then his rising out of it, a parallel to Jonah, but that the resurrection is the principal sign. And so our faith is not blind, but it's based on evidences. And that was what John had when he came to the tomb, and what Thomas had when he turned from his skepticism. But here you can see in Jesus's invitation, do you believe because you have seen me in the flesh, right? Oh, blessed are those who have not seen me and believed. And that's a picture of where you and I stand, right? Because I've not seen Jesus in the flesh, and yet I'm not without evidences. I'm not without the testimony of the shroud and the Thomases that have turned from their disbelief. But if they turned, that gives me reasons to believe too. I think Christians today need to know that there are very strong arguments for the truth of Christianity, and that we don't need to be ashamed when people point fingers at us and mock us for our belief. No, no, it's you kind of need more faith or fideism to disbelieve, I think, when you see just how much evidence is piled up. It's the most reasonable thing in the world to be Christian. But a lot of people are still unfamiliar with that, and they're very bashful about their beliefs. And I think the shroud empowers them to say, you know what? I can speak with confidence. Jesus is risen. Jesus is alive. And hey, look, I've come to know him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I was on a podcast, and there were three or four of us there, and we were talking about, what kind of proofs are there? And I took it one step further, and that is, what kind of proofs are there of Jesus that are not in the Bible?
Okay.
Because if it's just biblical, then it's like, well, of course the Bible, if you believe in the Bible, of course that's in there. But tell me something, give me a proof that Jesus existed
Hmm.
outside of the Bible. And
Yeah.
there's actually quite a few instances. First of all,
Francis.
you have to first say that, well, he existed, he was alive.
Right.
And then second of all, he was dead, he was crucified. And then third, is there proof of the resurrection? And for each of those to find proofs outside of the Bible, it gets harder and harder, of course, for the resurrection. But nevertheless, there are proofs of each one of those three things, and the shroud to me is definitely one of those proofs, or yeah, proofs of the resurrection, and that really, I
Yeah.
think, helps non-Christians to also see the value in what's going on with what's going on with Christianity.
Yes, I love the historical Jesus studies, especially when it comes to like proof of his existence. I don't know of any scholar worth his salt that is arguing that Jesus didn't exist. I mean, that's just not a defensible thesis statement. Um, but you're right to say that when it gets more specific to his resurrection, the the evidences are less um, inescapable, unavoidable, apodictic, to use the scholarly term. Um, in other words, when it comes to proof of resurrection, I prefer to use different language. I think it's philosophic. Sometimes we talk past each other with this point. I've written a short article on this question. I prefer to speak of evidence of resurrection and signs of resurrection, just because in mathematics and in philosophy, a proof is something that shows its conclusion inescapably, necessarily. If the premises are true, follow the syllogism, and the conclusion is impossible not to affirm. And yet we know that the resurrection is a dogma of faith in Christianity, and yet it's not without its evidences, right? We have signs. But also, do you know that there's a further problem with the language of proof, just because it comes from a Latin word which refers to the senses, right? So you taste, like to provare, even in Italian today, the word from which we get proof, it means to try or to taste, right? So it's something empirical. It's something you can measure. Well, how do I measure the resurrection? The resurrection is not the same thing as a reanimation, right? Lazarus was dead and reanimated. Lazarus was dead and resuscitated, but he was not in a state of glory. He was not in a state of immortality, not yet, right? The poor guy had to die twice. And so when we're speaking of the specifics of the resurrection of Jesus, how do we have proof that he passed not just from a cadaver in a state of death, right, into a state of life? That could have been just a, hey, CPR can do that sometimes, right? But what we're talking about in Jesus' resurrection is that no, his humanity is now in a state of divine glory. He's immortal. How do natural eyes see that? Well, they don't. They see the divine person in action. They see him, wait, he was on one side of the walls and now he's inside the upper room when the doors are locked. Um, it's clear that Jesus, in his resurrected state, has special qualities. Like, how does he appear in the guise of a gardener to Mary Magdalene? She knew him intimately, right? He had liberated her from seven demons. Cleopas and the beloved disciple who walk on the road to Emmaus, they talk for long hours, expositing scripture, and yet they don't recognize him, not until the breaking of the bread, the meal at the end of this long journey. And so Jesus is able to appear here and there. He shows up on a mountain in Galilee, which is a 4 or 5 day walk from Jerusalem, and he just meets them mysteriously on the mountain. So the early church has always recognized that Jesus's body has this special quality, this agility, this clarity, this luminosity, this and yet none of that is of itself the divine person, the divine glory. There are little hints that such a state is his, but we can't approvare, we can't sensibly receive or perceive the divine state. So I know it's a nitpicky point for some, but I think it's so important to not overstate just because you know the atmosphere that we're surrounded by. People are so quick to point fingers at us if we are not precise in our language. And so I'm keen to stay away from proof of resurrection language. I will say this because I do like to be charitable towards the person that I'm talking to always. In legal proceedings in America, we have changed the usage of this word. So legal proof is different than a philosophical or mathematical proof. So you've heard this language of beyond a shadow of a doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt. Sometimes it's impossible to reach the type of subjective certainty that says not a shadow of a doubt is here. But we can say in a legal way, look, there is no reasonable doubt here. In other words, every reasonable person will come to this same conclusion. All right, so that's to say when sometimes people are talking, when they're thinking of, oh, you're talking about probabilistic knowledge, this most certainly means I'm really, really convinced that this took place. At that point, I tend to agree. I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that gives us reasons to believe that the man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth and that this man has died and is risen. Sorry for that long-winded response, but I hope it clarifies and is helpful.
No, you're absolutely right to correct me, and I still haven't gotten my my mind, my mode in my mind to use the word evidence versus proof. So I appreciate that very much. And there's definitely a difference between evidence as well as opposed to proof. So we were both out at the conference in St. Louis. Tell
Yeah.
us about a little bit about what you spoke about, you presented
Okay.
there, and then tell us a couple of things that you found most interesting there.
Okay. Yeah. So, do you know, I often speak at the Society of Biblical Literature for my biblical studies, often focusing on Matthew, but I wanted to venture into um, John's Gospel because of John 20 and its importance for the shroud. So I said, look, I'll present a paper in Amsterdam to biblical scholars and see if it holds up to them. And then I'll present that same paper before shroud researchers and see if it holds up for them. Because this is what is often not done. We're not bringing those who are experts in exegesis in contact with those who are experts on the shroud, whether it's from science or archaeology, sometimes it's physics or chemistry or forensic medicine, but they're not talking to each other. It's like each is atomized or silos unto themselves. And what I think the great project of each person is to harmonize all the evidences. Like, if it's true, it's got to be synthetic, it's got to sit well with all the pieces of evidence. And so, what I did in St. Louis was to present um, my own hypothesis, which I think is pretty um, accessible to all, but it was not very ambitious, to be honest. It was the question is, how was the body of Jesus wrapped? Um, this is one of the most difficult questions, and I've noticed so much discrepancy, even amongst those who present on the shroud. And those who create images of how the body was wrapped. There is a lot that it leaves certain elements out, and so I wanted to argue from Scripture on the one hand, what picture I believe is being painted, and then from the shroud, what elements suggest a certain picture, and then see if they might harmonize. And so the basic and so I argue, big surprise, that they do harmonize, but it requires attention to details that have been often missed. In a nutshell, John 19:40, so important, so often um, missed or mistranslated. But it says there that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they took the body and, careful, they didn't wrap it. That is a word that is sometimes used. But in John 19:40, the word is bound, deo. And this is so important because it implies being secured. It's the language that we use when you go to prison. When you're prison, you're bound. When you're released, you're loosed. Do you remember this word pair that often appears in scripture, the binding and the loosing? Jews use it even to this day to describe the authority that one has. The power to bind and loose could mean adjudicating what is orthodox and what is not. If you're under a kind of excommunication or a kind of a punishment in the community, well, you might be loosed when you're freed from that punishment, or you've made atonement for it, or in death. So this is fascinating to me. But the prison of prisons is death, of course. What deeper dungeon could there be? And yet, when you're loosed, it's in new life. Okay, so this is important because there's a figurative meaning even beyond the literal one. What did they do, these elite Sanhedrists? They took the body of Jesus and they bound it with the spices, the aloes and myrrhs. How many times have you seen this element left out of the picture? I know I have, again and again and again. When they're wrapping the body, there is no consideration or illustration of 100 pounds. That is not a small amount. I mean, think of a 5 pound pack of coffee. I mean, it's about yay big, like a brick. You've got to multiply that times 15, because 15 times 5 is 75 pounds of ours. That corresponds to 100 Roman pounds from Jesus's day. Okay, so if this is his body, and you imagine 100 pounds need to accompany it, where do you put that? I imagine around all the periphery of the body. I don't know if they're sacks or bags or baskets. I don't know if they're loose piles of, kind of like dry pellets of aloe and myrrh. Many people have just imagined, even though it says nowhere in the text, that they anointed his body on Friday night with 100 pounds of aloe and myrrh. No evidence of that on the shroud. that they actually washed the body, that they anointed the body. In fact, what we read instead is that Mary Magdalene and the women that accompany her are going to anoint the body. And so I think it's more likely that they had prepared what they could on Friday night, but looking at their watches and realizing that the Sabbath was soon to descend upon them, they would have tucked away the body before the third star in the sky appears, and quickly out they go, but not without binding the body. Of course, you wouldn't want it to be exposed to, God forbid, animals or bugs or something like that, but just out of respect, and also just to contain the aloes and myrrhs and allowing the aromas to function as they're meant to, in close proximity to the body. They bound, most likely, at the legs. There's a crease between the knees and the ankles, suggestive that that binding did take place. According to the American scientists, there's a depression in the beard. Maybe there was a chin strap of sorts that kept the mouth, that would keep the mouth relatively closed. I know there's a debate about whether the lips are separated, etc. So my point is just to say all of, and I enumerate some 5 elements from the shroud, and I forget another handful from the scriptures to suggest that what the way the body was bound was, excuse the crude analogy, but like a taco. Okay, so you have 2 planes that are parallel. One creates the frontal image. That's what sits over his head. One creates the dorsal image. That's what's under his back. And yet, that's not the only picture. There's linen strips. This is yet a unique feature of my proposal, that in John chapter 11, Lazarus is bound. Lazarus is 3 days in the tomb. Lazarus, on the third day, is called out from death into life. Well, when he's buried according to the custom. And he's a Jew. Well, Jesus is buried according to the custom. John 19:40. Well, wait a minute. If Lazarus was bound at the hands and feet with linen strips, and Jesus in the same way, well, then we have to imagine that there's linen strips. In addition to the long sindom, the shroud is but one of the cloths mentioned. But in John chapter 20, the language is not sindom. It's not shroud. It's othonia, right? Othonia is such a key and important word. It doesn't mean shroud. My interpretation is that it means shroud plus these linen strips, the ones that bind at the hands and feet according to the custom. But they don't bind just the body, they bind the body and the aloes and myrrhs. And I think that's really important, because if you get there on Sunday and see exactly what you saw on Friday, wasn't John standing at the foot of the cross? Wasn't he the one that's narrating what Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea do when they bury him? Yes, so he saw how the body lay on Friday night. And now he sees the exact same thing in the exact same position and orientation, but no body. The body is absent. The cloth is collapsed. The only descriptor that we get in the Bible of these linen cloths, mentioned 3 times, is that they're keimena in Greek. They're lying. And I interpret that as lying flat, because they're lying empty or almost empty. The body isn't there, but hey, if those aloes and myrrhs didn't resurrect, they're still inside. And if that's the case, I can imagine John scratching his head saying, Lord, how'd you get out? How'd you get out without unbinding? And here's the figurative point that I wanted to bring out. Lazarus, when he's called out of the tomb, Jesus has to say, unbind him, right? Lazarus needs help from another to be unbound. Does Jesus? No, because Jesus isn't a creature. Jesus has divine power in himself. And so he is unbound in a very unique way by passing through, not by getting some friend to like undo some knots. No. It seems that his body just becomes mechanically transparent, to use the words of some moderns, right? And now the cloth can collapse. And I think that's a very strong argument for resurrection. You could understand now why John saw, and upon seeing that, saw and believed. How in the world could a tomb raider account for this? Getting the body out, but there's still aloes and myrrhs knotted inside of this, long taco-like the cloth that has linen strips around it on the outside. Oh, and this sudarium is rolled up and folded up on the side. Well, who did the folding? Who did the rolling? Someone's been up and about. Could it be Jesus? Um, I think all of that is said as a way of teeing up the the truth claim that comes at the end. He saw and believed. We could go on and on about that's the gist of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome, and yes, and it makes so much sense, and I like the way that exegetes use the prior usage of certain terms to make sure that they're understood in the current usage, as they're explained in this case in John, and so it
Yes.
really makes it understandable that he was bound, and in the same way, then Jesus may have also been bound based on the fact that the usage of the word is the same.
Yeah, thank you for making that point about context, right? Because this is what is often missed. If you just go to a dictionary, it might offer any number of possibilities, but you, as a responsible reader, have to choose in this paragraph, in this sentence, which usage is present here and now. There's a difference from a dictionary definition and the specific use. Scholars use the term a supposition. The supposition is the definition that it has in a particular sentence. And this is a mistake that many make again and again. I believe the NIV is a particular translation of the Bible, and it uses strips to translate the word Othonia. And you could tell that the image that comes to mind when you read that is that of a mummy, like where you have
Mm.
like, oh, because a strip for most of us means like a narrow bandage. And then maybe we wrap around 1,000 times to get all the way around a body. Well, never mind that that wasn't the way people were buried at that time. But in addition to that, it's not the context. And we know it's not the context, especially from Luke's gospel, especially as it's read in parallel with John's. So in Luke's gospel, when Jesus is buried, he's buried in the sindon. He's buried in the singular shroud. And we know the size of a shroud. It's large. It's not. How do we know this? Particularly from Mark 15. Do you remember when Jesus is in the agony in Gethsemane, and there's a young man who runs away naked? Well, he slips out of, guess what? This tunic actually has a word. In Greek, it's a sindon. Okay, it's a shroud, in other words. So how big is a shroud? Well, he's not in a tank top, right? He's clearly something that covers his body. It's a big cloth. Okay, and likewise, we see the shroud in its size. It's 4.4 meters wide. It's 14 foot 3. Okay, so this is a large cloth. That's what he's buried in on Friday. But keep reading. And when you come to the tomb, it's Easter morning, you see the stooping in order to look in. They see the Othonia. Well, wait a minute. What did they see? That which they laid there on Friday. So the Othonia is plural, and it means linen cloths. So isn't it reasonable to assume that what he's seeing on Sunday is what he saw on Friday? Now, if he uses a different word, it's not because the referent is altogether different. We know this especially because in John's gospel, we get the same language of stooping. Very, very specific. Many scholars think that there's a literary relationship between Luke and John. I know many people speak of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what is the relationship between John and Luke? If it's a literary relationship, then it's even more powerful when John uses the word stooping, endothonia. He's most likely referencing the same as Luke, who was, at that same time. John is an eyewitness to these things. And so if it's Luke using John or if it's John using Luke, There's either way, there's a strong argument to be made that Othonia refers to the shroud, but not the shroud only, the shroud plus at least one other thing. To get a plural, you need at least two. Well, what else was mentioned? These linen strips. These linen strips make sense of it. That's what's often left out. But it's a mistake, I think, to say that the Othonia are strips. Because there's a different word for strips. Read John 11, and the word is periai. That's not the word Othonia. That's a different word. So just getting the vocab right is very challenging. Not to mention that in so many foreign languages, people make a further confusion calling the shroud the headcloth. Oh, it's
Mm.
such a. I've seen this in French. It's in Slovenian.
Yep.
The sudarium. So in Greek, the word for the napkin or the handkerchief or the cloth, the thing that covered the head, it's sudarion in Greek. It's a loan word from Latin, a sudarium. But that's small. It's just the size of the head. And that's explained in John's gospel. It is epites kephalesautu, upon his head.
Mm.
Um, but what do they call the shroud in French? Le saint-suaire. The suaire is the sudarium. Likewise, in Slovenian, I was just there speaking, and they use the word perčič, I think it is. It's the sudarium, and they use that word to describe the shroud. Oh my goodness. So there's a lot of confusion, and so this will not be resolved just by going to your dictionary. You've got to read contextually to understand what each word means. So in synopsis, I think the sindone is the shroud, the Othonia is linen cloths, shroud plus the strips being keriai. There's so much confusion about that in the world of scholars. Even those who are well versed in the shroud generally can fall into, I think, expressions that are inconvenient because they've not done a deep dive into the lexica on the one hand, and then the contextual readings across the synoptics and as they parallel to John. It's complex. It's not easy, but that's why it's a real service to the community when experts can share, and then we can get straight our language.
Yeah, and one other thing I think that always concerns me, confuses me when you talk about the usage of the words. Um, these books and these stories were told for many years, for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, depending, and then they were
Mhm.
finally written down. And you wonder now back then, writing was incredibly expensive. And if
Mhm.
people wanted to remember something, they were probably very good at reciting a specific story and using probably the same words over and over and over again.
Yes,
But then, on the other hand, as you were talking, and I don't mean to go into this direction, but we might as well for a couple of
sure.
minutes, is 30 years later or 50 years later, when the actually were written down in a book, was there then some conflation between the two books that said, well, I'm going to use the same words that John used, and because this, as the storyteller and he may have gotten it wrong or it may have morphed over time and mutated to something else. And so, you wonder if there's that this also is an additional challenge that now goes into the original, the first writing down of each of those books.
Right. Well, I think we get a little window into this question at the prologue of Luke's gospel, right? Because he says right there in verses 1 through 4, the pro and 1 to 3, I, O Theophilus, many have recounted. I'm going to give you an orderly account. What's the insinuation? Well, others have gone before me, but man, I am going to dig deep into this and give you the best of the best. So I do believe that he is trying to clarify and to discern amongst many others. From a Christian perspective, we know that, yeah, it might be the word of, when you go to the liturgy, when you go to Mass in a Catholic church, the reading begins like this: a reading from the Gospel according to Mark, or Matthew or Luke or John. Do you know what we always say though at the end? We always say the word of the Lord. And so there's this sense that there's a there's a human author and there's a divine author. And these go together. And so on the one hand, it's it's a problem, it's a question. How is it that we have this word over here and this other word over here? And yet I think the Christian has to walk away and say, no, it's not a problem. It's added information. It's richness, right? It's actually better that we have four witnesses. Here's an image that I love that makes sense of it. When you go to a church, you often see like in St. Peter's, the Christ is represented by the altar in the center. And you have the four evangelists from the top of the dome looking down, but each with his own vantage point. And I always imagined them as, you know, portrait painters. And one's going to paint with his palette and from a certain angle, and another's going to be from the other side painting from his. And it's better for us to have four different versions that we know all of which are true, but there are choices being made by each individual artist. And that choice is helpful in some way. So look, I'm glad to know that a sindone is being used. That's true. I'm also glad to know that it's the shroud plus linen strips. That's extra information. Had I had just Othonia or just shroud, it would be very difficult to reconstruct the full picture. But because this complexity is given me by diverse witnesses, I'm able to understand more than I ever could if I just had one. And so we don't want one. You know, the Christian church has always resisted that effort. You know, there was the diatessaron, this idea
Hmm.
that we would squish into one account. Look, there's one Jesus, we ought to have one gospel. And yet the church said, no, no, we're going to have four. And they're going to be distinct. But that distinctiveness is good because each one has an editorial profile and he's got some insight into Jesus and his story, some insight as to what took place. And so the complexity, while difficult, is richness that we ought to embrace and try to unpack, try to make sense of. Not easy, but worth it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also when you think about witnesses in general in a legal, and you brought up legal before, if you were in court and each of the witnesses said exactly the same thing, that would
Right.
also be potentially suspicious. So if each
Absolutely.
one of them has a slightly different vantage point, and so the four, the four images of the four, apostles of, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it really does make sense that they should be slightly different, that the
Right.
general story is the same, but there's little nuances and little
Right.
additions and subtractions here and there to
Yeah.
really
And
bring out color into the whole picture.
that's true. And then you find these passages that might have 21 words in a row that are exactly the same. And so this does occur. So it's not just oral tradition, but there's also a literary relationship between certainly the synoptics. In other words, they saw each other's writings. And because it's hard to imagine, even if I heard a passage being recounted, but to get 21 words in a row, exactly verbatim, is very challenging. And so it's, I think, easy to see the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a literary one. What's only recently being re-examined is the relationship between John and the Synoptics. And so there is a scholar by the name of Dr. Mark Goodacre at Duke who has recently written a book about this, and I think it's at least worth paying attention to. It's not a scholarly consensus, certainly not, but there I think John 20 is an interesting case study, especially when you get this very specific language of stooping, and then in connection with the Euthonia and just the way it's told. I don't know. I hold this lightly, but I am inclined to think that somebody saw the written version of the other. whether it's Luke that used John or John that used Luke. I'll let the scholars go back and forth on that. But I think that's an even stronger case to make that the Athonia, the linen cloths, include the shroud and is not to be translated strips. I wish we would just do away with those translations. And most, by the way, most versions of the Bible do, or they have done away with the language of strips in John chapter 20. But I find that that's a very kind of slavish use of the lexicon that hasn't paid close attention to the context. And that's why we fall into that error
Right.
sometimes.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and that's fantastic. And I'd love to keep on going, but at some point we need to close. I do have one last question for you, though, and that is you're out in California right now, and there
Yes.
is a new Shroud Museum out there. And so tell us a little bit about that and what's really cool, and we'll close it off.
Thank you for that. Yes, I do believe this is probably the most world-class shroud exhibit in the world. Part of that just has to do with, look, in Southern California, they do things, they do them right. This is a multi-million dollar project, and I'm so happy that it's now available for everyone. But it's the same shroud exhibit that you'll find in Rome and in Jerusalem and in dozens of other cities. The Othonia exhibit is traveling, and you've seen those 24 panels. Sometimes Protestant pastors have used the same. Dr. Jeremiah Johnson, I know Dr. Scott Stripling, and I think now Craig Evans. I'm so happy to see that they're using the Othonia exhibit as well. So that same exhibit that you've seen so many times is now planted in Orange County, but they've just souped it up, right? So they've made what's called an immersive experience. There are three galleries, and in those three galleries, you have the story of the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. Then the lights go down, and this tomb opens up. You step into a cave-like space, and there they tell the story of the death, the burial of Jesus, and there the shroud features prominently. But then the lights go down once again. It's kind of like the resurrection moment. The cloth collapses. You step into room three, and it tells the story all in picture um, of the resurrection of Jesus. Visually, and also I would say experientially, right? It's a shroud experience. It's just very moving. So there's plenty of information, but above all, for those who are just being introduced, they're going to know who Jesus is, how he suffered, what the artifact witnesses, and it leaves you with a message that he has he has risen and he remains as he promised. I'm with you always to the end of the age, right? This is Jesus's statement says, in the resurrection, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus says, you will see me coming on the clouds of heaven, seated at the right hand of power. That Jesus hasn't just died and gone up and away. He hasn't just risen and absented himself, but he's here and he's in his church and you can know him. And that's the message of this museum, all as an immersive experience. So I'm excited to see this is now it was showcased in its inauguration in November, and now it's been even slightly tweaked and improved. It's the most spectacular version of a shroud museum that I've ever seen. There you have all the instruments of torture. You have these 24 panels. You have the replica of the body, replica obviously of the shroud. You have the Ricci crucifix that's coming in on Tuesday or Thursday. I forget which day they're going to bless the new, the Sindonic cross, the cross.
Hmm.
So Jesus as not in the supine position as we see him in the shroud, but when he's vertical, when he's erect on the cross, but all of that as an extrapolation from information on the shroud. So all of this is a very not only didactic, like a teaching tool, but it's something that stirs the emotions, that um, plays on your heartstrings and beckons you to come to know and love this Jesus who has died and risen for us. And so, yeah, it's in Christ Cathedral in Garden Grove here in Orange County, California.
Fantastic. And what is the exact name?
It's the Shroud of Turin immersive experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, fantastic. That is, I mean, you've brought so many things to light, and you know, you just bring this message that is just so well spoken and well delivered. I really appreciate it, and it's really an honor to have you on our podcast. And so, thank you so much for that. And for the audience, certainly, if you'd like to learn more about the Shroud, there's many different sources. There's, I think it's Athonia.com is one. There's Shroud.com. There's ShroudofTurin.com. There's many, many different sources on there, and all of them have some great information to really understand the science as well as the kind of the non-science of the shroud.
That's right. And I would really just recommend, if you've not done so already, go to athonia.org or athonia.com and subscribe to the newsletter because things are happening at such a fast pace. Materials, free materials, if you're in a classroom, if you're in a position to teach to children or to just your family members. Also, new initiatives that I'm so hopeful will be in uh, available in the very near future. You can become a sponsor of, if you believe in this message of evangelizing through the shroud, please consider donating. There's so many initiatives. We have just begun our work, and for many years we've been very small. And I really feel a calling from the Lord to grow this so that everyone can know this. I'm happy that I've received it, but if I look around, many of my colleagues, we're getting older in years, and we have to pass the baton off to the younger generations. And if you believe in that message, please consider sponsoring Othonia because we're getting out there, and we have a lot of good benefactors, but we are so small compared to the mission that I believe God is calling us to. So thank you for all of those who do support us just by visiting the website and just by plugging in regularly. That means so much. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, I don't remember if it's orthonia.org or orthonia.com, but certainly
And I think
that's
it's both.
yeah, it may be both, and so definitely go to those, and then there you can search on the internet nowadays and on YouTube and whatever on the Shroud, and there's so many good things out there. But I really do believe though that Athonia .org or .com is probably one of the best sources, and if you're in Southern California and you can get to see this exhibit. I haven't been there, but I do plan on being there at some point, and then get a chance to visit that. Well, with that, Father Dalton, thank you so much for being on, and for the audience, definitely stay tuned for many other episodes in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. Thank you.